You are watching the For Fact's Sake podcast from The Ferret, where we take a deep dive into the world of misinformation and fact checking. This week, we spoke to Polly Curtis from the think tank Demos about the threat that generative AI could play in this year's elections. If you like this podcast, hit the subscribe button, and we've got much more coming for you this year.
My name is Polly Curtis. I'm the Chief Executive at the cross-party think tank Demos, and previously in my career I've been a journalist, so I care about really great information journalism and how it intersects with democracy and the country's well-being. I think very important, but I think what's hard to judge is how much more important this year than previous years compared with future years. Where are we in the kind of evolution of these things? Because what we know is that the last 10 years, democracy has been profoundly impacted by the change in how all our communication systems work, by the pace of the media, by the digitization, by the change in the power dynamics in information, really. So, 20 years ago, when I was starting out as a journalist at The Guardian, a newspaper published something and it was kind of announcing something to the world and it was a fact. And there were no feedback mechanisms. Now, every fact that goes into the world is dissected and distributed and bashed around. And it's very complex, the media system at the moment. So for any politician that wants to communicate their messages kind of truthfully and directly, it's actually quite hard to do now because there's so much disruption and different kind of information flows in the system. But also there is a hell of a lot of space for disinformation and misinformation to both be produced and consumed and distributed. So what we did was spent a long time talking to lots of people who work in political communications and the communications industry in one way or the other. And the specific question we were asking is, how are you using generative AI tools? So AI has been around for a long time, has had a huge impact on the way information travels, the kind of micro-targeting of advertising during elections that has been so hotly contested, that's accused of creating these echo chambers and misinformation, all of these things. That's all, has AI in it to different extents. But what's different this year is generative AI and the accessibility of generative AI tools. It means anyone can produce content that's not real or based in fact at a scale never known before. And so we talked to lots of people who work in communications about how they're adopting these technologies, and it's hugely variable at the moment. So some people are using generative AI to produce social media posts, to help them research. We talked to parliamentarians who are using generative AI to help them do their briefings for their speeches in Parliament. There's a lot of space it's being used already, but it's not actually changing the outcome hugely significantly at the moment. A lot of the kind of fake images that I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, we could have produced with Photoshop before. It's just got easier and it's in people's hands. One of the big differences is the accessibility of producing fake audio and video, and that's much harder for people to assess the provenance of. So I guess overall what we were seeing is people using it a bit, but really we're standing on a precipice, and what it's done is shone a light on misinformation and disinformation again, for good or bad. I think awareness is growing, and just based on that example, there was some research recently which found a whole load of deepfake videos of Rishi Sunak promoting cryptocurrency. Those kind of examples mean that there is a lot of awareness within the system that this has potential in this election cycle. But actually, the action is relatively slow, and it's really difficult to take kind of proactive kind of measures on this. So, what are the tools you could reach for to try and kind of safeguard democracy from some of this misinformation, disinformation. You can look to legislation. Actually, legislation is too slow to do anything ahead of an election. And I promise you, if we tried to rush through legislation now while the technology is so in flux, it wouldn't be good legislation that would last very long. There's some existing powers. So under the Online Safety Act, in Westminster, the that gave Ofcom some powers to look at disinformation and misinformation, and they've got a committee that's looking at that at the moment. That needs to kind of come out with some positions on this. So there's legislation. Then there's the technology companies themselves, and they are hyper aware of this. They've got all these new generative AI tools out there, and if they screw up global democracy, they're going to have a bit of a problem on their hands. So they are hyper aware of this. All the technology companies are looking at watermarking, kite marking, different ways to label content, but none of that technology is there yet. None of it is good enough. In the work we did, we came up with one suggestion, which was really for political parties to show some leadership in this. We know political parties are excited about some of these tools. It makes their communications like much easier, and there are benefits in that as well. But we think that there's scope for some kind of cross-party agreement where they could come together and just agree the rules and the terms and the guidance of how they're going to do this, just so that they're modelling best practice, but also kind of starting to set the norms. What's okay to use generative AI for? What's not? It's really, really difficult. I totally agree. You're so right. Because a lot of this is coming from bad actors, from other countries with interests in messing with other democracies, from people who are using Rishi Sunak's videos to promote scams online. Those kind of things. That the political kind of acts in this is a tiny, tiny element. So we've made that suggestion, but we don't think that kind of solves the problem at all. It's just looking for kind of actionable things that can happen in the short term. Long term, there will have to be legislation, new legislation, the technological solutions coming on stream. There's a kind of societal response as well, and about how we educate ourselves to respond to misinformation and disinformation. So there's really no silver bullet. There's no kind of like, we're a think tank, we come up with policies, we want big ideas to solve problems. There isn't one solution to this. It's going to take all of these elements to take responsibility, and just we've looked to political leadership because that's something that can happen now, and would mark democracy out as different from all the bad things that are happening on the internet, and model a different kind of behavior. I think that is an important element, but it's by no means the only one. There's definitely more awareness, and that kind of idea of standing on a precipice is quite interesting, because I think what we're seeing at the moment is, and what we'll see over the course of this year, is an amplification of the misinformation and disinformation we've seen previously. It's just easier to produce. But actually, the really profound difference that generative AI could make probably won't happen this year, but is much bigger. It is potentially as disruptive as the internet or social media or iPhones, like those things that actually changed the way information flows and how we behave. Um, so the change we'll see this year is just more of what we've seen previously, and actually it's quite helpful because there's more attention on it now to actually create some momentum for change. I'd love to come back and talk more about kind of what the potential for longer term change is. But first, I just think it's worth saying that there is a potential downside to the awareness as well. This idea of the liar's dividend, where just the existence of fake information out there not only makes people question the truth of everything they're watching and kind of disengage and lose interest because they just don't trust anything, but also that bad political actors will play on that and use, the whole Donald Trump fake news accusation was a kind of disruption of our whole kind of system of beliefs around information. And that I think is the biggest threat we face this year, is just that people switch off because they see one deep fake or hear about one deep fake and think they can't trust anything anymore. Yeah, I think the work that Full Fact has done in this area, and I'm sure the work guys do as well, kind of really exposes the worst of that. I think the way social media works and the algorithms work, it does reduce arguments to binaries. It just reduce everything. It creates no space for nuance, and so things become less and less true. Politicians have always made political cases for things that might ignore certain facts, might overemphasize other facts, might stretch them, but it's where the kind of line is between kind of political rhetoric and actually kind of breaking into untruths. I think it's really important that both are held to account on, but also that in an age of misinformation, disinformation, they rise above and act differently and don't play that game. Yeah, I think so. I think that that is true. I think there are more kind of accountability mechanisms in the media, but when you've got so much commentary around it, actually, kind of the distrust that underpins all of that means that fact checkers can be as distrusted as politicians. Kind of, I think there is the kind of the wider environment of distrust. Which that plays into is really problematic, and it does a disservice to all the politicians who are truthful and who do care about kind of what they're doing and what they're saying, and about accuracy, of which there are many more. And there is a like that's a it's really difficult in the reporting and the highlighting of this, of getting the balance right between highlighting it, holding it to account, and not over amplifying it. The Starmer audio, a colleague pointed out to me the other day that the engagement around the fakery of it was much higher than around the original content. So more people understood there was fake content online than understood that then believed the original thing. And what does that do to our wider kind of trust in the information environment? So, I mean, the parliamentarian I talked to, who was very open about his use of generative AI to support his briefings, was actually in the Lords, where they have less staffing, and so what he was using it for was, when he was going into a debate, he might have 10 briefing papers from various charities and groups who are interested in the area, and he was using it to digest all of those. So it would take 300 pages and produce a 10-page digest that he could go to, check it back against the information to make sure that it hadn't hallucinated or kind of misidentified anything. But it was just like a really quick and helpful and way to kind of assess a big bit of information. Crucially, he was then transparent in the subsequent speech about his use of it, and I think that's really crucial for kind of engendering trust, being really kind of open about the use of it. When you look at things like public consultations or a select committee that's getting huge amounts of data inputted into an inquiry, there are some really legitimate uses of generative AI to help digest and access and find the commonalities across all of that. Of course, it always needs a human in the loop to check that it, hasn't misinterpreted things. But with the right applications, I think it could kind of speed up a lot of processes in the kind of current kind of democratic system. Um, but but the way it could be used in the future is far more profound and very, very different. So one example is that ChatGPT announced a load of things it was doing ahead of the elections to safeguard democracy. And one of the things it's not letting politicians and democratic institutions do is use its technology to create a chatbot that pretends to be a political candidate or a local government or a public institution. And the reason is not confident enough about the technology to kind of get that right, because what you can see in the future is I have a chatbot of my local MP who happens to be Keir Starmer, who's quite busy with other things at the moment, and I can have a direct conversation with him and say, "What do you think of this? What do you think of this? What do you think of this?" And if that Kearbot has been trained on everything he's ever said and everything he believes, then you could actually have an interesting interaction where you could get a better sense of him. But at the moment, what is it going to go and make up? And that, for me, if I was running that political campaign, I'd be absolutely terrified to have those things out there, kind of speaking on behalf of the parties. But potentially there is a world in which political engagement can be enhanced in some way through these methods. I think that's where the technology becomes really important, and every kind of platform that's working in this area is looking at ways to this. Facebook made a big announcement this week. I know there are more announcements coming from the generative AI companies jointly, kind of in coming weeks, and so being able to kind of kite mark or have metadata that says exactly where the information has come from. It can get incredibly detailed. You can have it down to kind of what prompts produce this content. But none of it, like there was a great piece in Wired end of last year that kind of that tested all the systems and found workarounds to get around all of them at the moment. So none of them are perfect. But I think that's got to be the only way, that if there is some kind of back end underlying data that anyone can access, it's not going to help the public, because actually the skill and understanding you need to be able to kind of understand what that data means is really hard. But in terms of being able to fact check and say whether things are truthful or not, hopefully it will get there. Yeah, and part of the problem with that is that it needs to be an international response as well. It's like it really, makes a mockery of national laws, in a way. Like they just don't work for this. I think what's different this time compared with social media is that we've been through it before, so there's almost kind of a collective memory about, oh, this feels like that period back then when everything was changing, and that brings kind of a much more heightened awareness, so people understand that this is a big change we're going through and that there needs to be action. But it also brings quite a lot of baggage, and this is a different technology, but I do think it has the potential. If you think pre and post social media, how that changed the power dynamics in the information environment, we couldn't really have conceived of it beforehand. And I think we're in that space at the moment where we're talking about kind of chatbots. I think it's really and how that one-to-one communication works. Someone very respected in this area in a Chatham House conversations, I won't name him, said this thing about how social media was wired for engagement. So it was about eyeballs and just kind of finding the quickest way, like TikTok does, to get as many eyeballs on something for advertising revenue as possible. Generative AI is wired for intimacy. It wants to know and understand and nurture and support you. And so this person's argument was that once you get chatbots kind of iterating relationships with individuals, that really disrupts how we relate to each other, how friendship works, how religion works, how politics works. It changes how we nurture belief between us as communities. And that's where my brain kind of slightly pops and it all feels very futuristic. But I think that is as different as going back to pre and post social media age. Mm. So we're doing some really, really interesting work at the moment, in three very local areas in England, where they've introduced low traffic neighbourhoods. So stick with me. This is a kind of like micro point, but it tells a bigger story. And it looks at where there have been these really furious rows in communities about the introduction of low traffic neighbourhood schemes. And it looks at how the misinformation and disinformation has travelled online around that. But actually, the thing that we're learning most is how poor the communication is offline. So actually, the failure there, and these are very emerging findings. Like I've literally just been in a conversation where we're gathering the first qual evidence. So we've got quite a long way to go to distill this. But actually, the emerging findings are about how poor the relationship and communication is between authorities and communities, and how easy it is to disrupt that because people don't believe or trust their local council, and therefore will believe and trust the people who are relating to the same feelings they have more. Um, so I think kind of we focus a lot on misinformation and disinformation online, but what does it actually say about our real world connections and relationships that might be more important and more profound?